The relentless, gentle ticking of a dozen clocks was the soundtrack of my marriage, a symphony of ordered time conducted by my husband Arthur. He was a horologist, a restorer of antique timepieces, and our home was a sanctuary of measured moments. The air hummed with the soft, metallic whispers of regulator pendulums, the stately talk of a long-case grandfather, the cheerful skip of a porcelain Biedermeier. Arthur's hands, always faintly smelling of lemon oil and fine metal, moved with a surgeon's precision over tiny, intricate wheels. He spoke in the language of escapements and mainsprings, of beat rates and amplitudes. Our life together was a beautifully calibrated mechanism. Dinners at 7, Sunday walks at 10, lovemaking on Saturday nights, reliable, gentle, and as predictable as the sunrise over the meticulously trimmed hedge of our Georgian townhouse. I was Imogen, the clockmaker's wife, and I believed I was content, mistaking the absence of discord for the presence of passion, the reliable tick for the beat of a heart. My own time felt suspended, a ghost in the machine. I worked as a freelance illustrator, specializing in botanical prints, my days spent bending over watercolor paper, capturing the fleeting, anarchic beauty of flowers that knew nothing of schedules. My studio was at the back of the house, overlooking a small wild garden I nurtured against Arthur's preference for orderly boxwood. Here, amidst the scent of paint and loam, the ticking was muffled. Here I sometimes caught myself holding my breath, as if waiting for a different kind of chime. I met Julian Thorne on a Tuesday afternoon in early October, in the chaotic, fragrant belly of the New Covent Garden flower market. I was hunting reference specimens for a commission on heirloom roses. He was arguing passionately with a vendor over the last crate of late-blooming Pierre de Ronsard. "But you don't understand," he was saying, his voice a warm, rich baritone that cut through the din of trolleys and shouted prices. "It's not just a rose, it's the character. The climber on the south wall is a braggart, all showy first blooms. This one is the secretive, late-blooming poet. They're a dialogue." I stopped, a smile tugging at my lips. He was tall, with an untidy mane of copper-brown hair, and a face that seemed more lived in than handsome, etched with laugh lines and a certain intensity around the eyes which were the color of moss agate. He was dressed in worn corduroys and a paint-splattered wax jacket, a stark contrast to Arthur's ever-pressed shirts. "The Pierre can be a diva, if not pruned with conviction," I found myself saying. He turned, and his gaze, focused and immediate, felt like a spotlight. "A woman who speaks fluent rose," he said, his annoyance melting into a grin. "A rare creature. You'd save me from horticultural murder." We shared the crate. He was a theatrical set designer, he explained, sourcing inspiration and actual flora for a radical new production of A Midsummer Night's Dream. "Oberon isn't a king in my version," he said, hefting his half of the roses with ease. "He's the spirit of untamed growth. The set will be a living, breathing forest that encroaches on the rational Athenian court. A celebration of glorious, messy chaos. Glorious, messy chaos." The phrase reverberated in me like a struck gong. It was the antithesis of everything in my life. As we walked out into the gray London morning, our breath misting, he asked what I did. I told him. "Ah," he said, his eyes crinkling. "So you capture wildness and frame it. A beautiful, poignant contradiction." Arthur never called my work poignant. He called it charming, a lovely hobby. He framed my best pieces and hung them in the downstairs loo. Julian asked to see my portfolio, claiming a need for a botanical authenticity for his set. It was a flimsy, transparent pretext, and we both knew it. Yet I gave him my card. The paper seemed to burn my fingers as I handed it over. The first transgression was not a touch, but a surrender of time. I agreed to meet him at his studio, a vast, converted warehouse in Shoreditch, 2 days later. I told Arthur I was meeting a potential new client, a boutique herbalist wanting packaging illustrations. The lie was a small, cold pebble in my throat, but I swallowed it. Julian's studio was chaos incarnate. Canvases leaned against walls, some painted, some bare. Fabric swatches dripped from rails like jungle vines. Model sets, fantastical and intricate, occupied tables. And everywhere there were plants in pots and jars, cuttings rooting in water, a veritable indoor thicket. The air smelled of turpentine, soil, and coffee. And it was silent, no clocks. The only sound was the distant rumble of the city and the hum of a space heater. It's magnificent, I breathed, my senses overwhelmed. It's a bloody mess, he laughed, clearing a stool for me. But it's a fertile mess. Time works differently here. It expands and contracts based on creative necessity, not some arbitrary tick. He showed me his sketches for the dream. They were breathtaking, wild, sensual, pulsating with a life that felt more real than my own neatly ordered existence. He spoke of texture, of mood, of using light and shadow to create emotion. He asked for my opinion not as a decorative artist, but as a collaborator. That ivy you painted for the chemist's shop, he said, pulling up an image on his laptop from my website. See how it seems to be straining against the brickwork? That tension, that's what I need. The sense that the natural world is not a backdrop, but a character, impatient, hungry. No one had ever looked at my work and seen impatience or hunger. They saw pretty leaves. I felt in that cluttered, vibrant space, a lock deep inside me click open. We began to meet regularly. The lies blossomed with practiced ease. Client revisions, site visit to the future theater, networking event for illustrators. Arthur, trusting and immersed in the silent conversation between a pinion and a crown wheel, merely nodded. Good for your career, Emmy, he'd say, his attention already drifting back to the fragile skeleton of a 17th century table clock on his workbench. With Julian, time didn't tick. It flowed, it pooled, it evaporated. A planned 1-hour meeting could stretch into 3, filled with talk that spiraled from the symbology of night-blooming flowers to our deepest creative fears. He was divorced, amicably, he said, married young to another artist who had craved a different kind of stability, one with actual walls and a pension. He understood the conflict, he said, between the yearning for a safe harbor and the siren call of the open, stormy sea. Most people choose the harbor and spend their lives listening to the foghorn with a quiet ache, he said, looking directly at me. I looked away, my cheeks burning. The first touch happened in the National Gallery of all places. We'd gone to study the botanical details in the backgrounds of Renaissance paintings. Standing before Van Eyck's Arnolfini portrait, we were arguing softly about the symbolism of the single candle in the chandelier. It's the eye of God, I whispered, citing the standard interpretation. Rubbish, Julian murmured back, his shoulder brushing mine. It's the fragility of the moment, the breath before the sigh, the second before the clock would chime, if there were one in the painting. As he spoke, his hand found mine, hidden by the folds of my coat. His fingers laced through mine, warm and sure. It wasn't a romantic gesture. It felt like a pact, a connection of shared understanding. My heart didn't flutter. It seemed to stop entirely, suspended in a perfect silent moment he had just described. I didn't pull away. We stood like that for a full minute, hands secretly joined, staring at a marriage portrait from 1434, while my own marriage quietly fractured in the space between our heartbeats. After that, the affair began in earnest. It was not merely physical, though that came too, in his sun-drenched studio on a pile of old drapes, a frantic, beautiful collision that was all gas and sunlight and the smell of dust and us. It was emotional, intellectual. He reignited parts of my mind that had gone dormant. I started painting differently, darker, more textured, with thorns and twisted roots and flowers that looked like they could devour sunlight. Arthur noticed. These are rather intense, darling, he said, peering at a new piece of a rose with petals edged in black. Is everything all right? Everything's fine, I said, the lie now a familiar, sour taste. Just exploring a new style. With Julian, I was an explorer. With Arthur, I was a maintainer of the status quo. I became a master of dual timekeeping. My phone had 2 calendars. The official one held dental appointments, dinners with Arthur's horology colleagues, reminders to wind the Viennese regulator. The private passcode-locked one held entries like S, discuss Act 3 foliage, or M, life drawing, evening. The latter was code for our trysts. I grew adept at calculating trajectories, leaving just enough time to erase the scent of Julian's studio, a mix of turpentine and his particular sandalwood soap, from my skin before returning home to the lemon oil scent of Arthur's embrace. The guilt was a constant, low-grade fever. It spiked violently at moments of Arthur's unconscious kindness. When he brought me tea as I painted, when he carefully fixed the loose clasp on my grandmother's brooch without being asked, when he talked about our future, about maybe moving to the country where he could have a larger workshop and where I could have a proper studio. Lots of light for you, my love, he'd say, and the endearment would feel like a dagger. I began to pick fights over trivial, stupid things. The volume of the radio, the fact he'd used the last of the milk. I was trying subconsciously to build a case against him, to paint his stability as stagnation, his kindness as weakness, to justify the seismic betrayal I was committing. One afternoon in Julian's studio, I broke down. We had just made love, and a crushing wave of guilt washed over me. I wept into his shoulder, choking out fragments of my self-loathing. He's a good man, Julian. He doesn't deserve this. I'm a monster. He held me, stroking my hair. You're not a monster, Imogen, he said, his voice gentle. You're a woman who was sleeping, and now you're awake. Waking up is a violent, disruptive act. It sometimes breaks the bed you're lying in. His words were a solace and a condemnation. He framed my deceit as a kind of heroic self-actualization. I clung to that narrative. It was the only way to bear the weight. The double life required constant vigilance. I bought a separate, cheap pay-as-you-go phone for communicating with Julian, hiding it in the lining of my painting satchel. I became paranoid about perfume, about stray hairs, about the time. I'd leave his studio and immediately check my watch, calculating the commute home, the story I'd tell. My sleep became fractured, haunted by dreams of ticking that accelerated into a maddening roar, or of beautiful, intricate clocks whose faces would melt like Deleuze watches. The cracks began to show in my primary life. I forgot our wedding anniversary. Arthur came home with flowers and a beautifully wrapped vintage ladies' travel clock, his face falling when he saw my blank confusion. The client deadline, I stammered. It's just been so all-consuming. More consuming than us? He asked, the question quiet, wounded. I made a show of effusive gratitude, but the damage was done. A new, watchful sadness entered his eyes. He began to notice the late returns, the distracted air, the new edgy paintings that were so unlike me. He started checking the official calendar more often, his brow furrowed. The crisis point was, fittingly, about time. Julian's production of A Midsummer Night's Dream was going into final technical rehearsals. He begged for me to come to a dress rehearsal. I need your eyes, Imogen, your sensibility. You've been part of this from the start. It was a Wednesday evening. Arthur and I had tentative plans to attend a lecture on marine chronometers. I manufactured a crisis. I called Arthur from a park, my voice tight with faux panic. It's Mrs. Abernathy, I said, referencing my most demanding, elderly client. She's had a fall. She's all alone. I have to go sit with her, maybe take her to A&E. It could be all night. Don't wait up. The lie was elaborate, cruel in its exploitation of a vulnerable fictional person. Arthur, concerned, offered to come help. My refusal was too sharp, too quick. No, she's proud. She wouldn't want a stranger. I'll handle it. I hung up, my hands trembling. The dress rehearsal was magical. Julian's vision was fully realized, a sensual, overwhelming riot of growth and shadow. The living plants, the eerie lighting, the raw performance. It was glorious, messy chaos made flesh. I watched, mesmerized from the back of the dark auditorium, feeling like I was part of something vital, something that mattered. Afterwards, in his dressing room, smelling of grease paint and sweat, he kissed me with the fervor of a man celebrating a triumph. You see, he said against my lips, this is what we can make. This is real. I arrived home at 1 a.m., exhausted, elated, and steeped in guilt. The house was dark, but not silent. The clocks ticked their relentless chorus. Arthur was sitting in his armchair in the living room, not reading, not working, just sitting. The single lamp beside him illuminated his face, which was pale and set in lines of profound exhaustion. On the table beside him lay my secret pay-as-you-go phone. It was dead, but its mere presence was an indictment. I had, in my rushed, euphoric departure, forgotten to take it from my satchel. My blood turned to ice. Mrs. Abernathy's neighbor is a member of the Horological Society, Arthur said, his voice utterly flat, stripped of all its usual gentle warmth. It was the sound of a mainspring snapping. I called to see if you needed supplies for an overnight stay. She's been in Dorset with her daughter for a fortnight. He looked at the cheap phone. Then this started buzzing. Earlier, with messages. About the magic of tonight. About missing someone's touch. The silence that followed was worse than any accusation. It was filled only by the maddening, omnipresent tick-tick-tick of 100 measuring seconds I had tried to steal for myself. Who is he? The question was a simple request for data, the final variable in a broken equation. There was no point in lying. The evidence was incontrovertible. In that quiet, ticking room, I confessed. I told him about Julian, the flower market, the studio, the talks, the National Gallery, the affair. I did not spare myself. I gave him the ugly, unvarnished truth, all of it. As I spoke, I watched the man I had married disintegrate. His face, usually so composed in concentration, collapsed through stages of shock, incredulity, and finally a harrowing, silent agony. I had not just broken a promise, I had vandalized the very concept of time and trust upon which he had built his life. When my voice finally faded, he stood up. He walked over to his workbench, where the 17th century table clock sat, its movement exposed, a universe of tiny, interdependent parts. He picked up a delicate tweezers, not to work, but as a focal point. His back was to me. I repair clocks, he said, his voice trembling with the effort to control it. I understand that any mechanism, no matter how complex, relies on fundamental principles. The escape wheel must engage the pallet fork with perfect consistency. The smallest flaw, a speck of dust, a hairline crack, and the entire system fails. The time it tells becomes a fiction. He turned and his eyes were red-rimmed but dry. I believed our marriage was a masterpiece of engineering. I believed in its reliability. But you, Imogen, you were the flaw in the escapement. You made every second we've shared for the past year a lie. You've broken the beat of us. It can't be fixed. He didn't shout. He didn't cry. He simply stated it as a horological fact. He moved out that night. He packed a small suitcase with a methodical, heartbreaking care, taking only his tools, a few books, and the photograph of us on our honeymoon in Venice, standing before the Torre dell'Orologio. He left the house, the clocks, the furniture, everything that represented us. He needed a clean space, he said, a place without the constant, mocking reminder of measured time. The front door closed with a soft, final click, quieter than any clock chime. Yet it echoed through the hollowed-out shell of my life. The aftermath was a protracted, painful dismantling. Arthur was scrupulously, civilly fair through his solicitor. The divorce was a dry, procedural unwinding of assets. He let me keep the house. He couldn't bear, his solicitor wrote, to live among the clocks anymore. My father, a retired engineer who admired Arthur deeply, was crushed. He was a man of integrity, Imogen. You treated his heart like a faulty component to be replaced. The condemnation in his eyes was worse than any legal decree. In the weeks after, I went to see Julian's play. It was a critical success. At the opening night party, he was the center of a buzzing crowd, glowing with triumph. I stood on the periphery, a ghost. He saw me, excused himself, and pulled me into a quiet corner. His hug was enthusiastic, but his eyes were already scanning the room over my shoulder. You came. Wasn't it brilliant? Listen, things are mad now. The BBC wants to talk adaptation. I'm going to be impossible to reach for a bit. He kissed my cheek, a perfunctory brush. We'll talk soon, yes? He was already turning away, drawn back to the light and the noise. I was not his collaborator anymore. I was a piece of the chaotic, fertile past that had fueled his present success. My function was complete. The silence in the house was absolute. I had stopped winding the clocks. One by one, they ran down the grandfather clock's pendulum, swung to a halt with a last, weary sigh. The cheerful Biedermeier gave a final, hesitant skip and fell silent. The Viennese regulator's beat faded into nothingness. The symphony was over. The only sound was the ragged rhythm of my own breathing, and the memory of ticks in my ears. I tried to paint, but my botanical subjects now seemed grotesque, their beauty a taunt. I saw only decay in the petals, tyranny in the twisting vines. I had sought glorious, messy chaos, and I had found it. It had consumed my marriage, my integrity, my peace. It had not set me free. It had left me stranded in a vast, silent emptiness where time had no measure, no meaning, no end. I sold the townhouse, the clocks going to a specialist dealer. I moved to a small modern flat with white walls and no history. I took a job as a graphic designer for a blandly sensible gardening catalog. My illustrations reduced to cheerful, soulless clip art. I live now in a world of digital clocks and silent phones. Sometimes in the dead of night, I startle awake, my body still remembering the rhythm of 100 ticking clocks, a symphony I conducted to its ruin. I am the clockmaker's ex-wife, living in the endless, unmeasured silence after the last gear has ground to a halt, a permanent inhabitant of the hollow moment between the tick and the tock that never comes.